Welcome to the Emerson Polling Report. I'm Lauren Granada, joined by professor and pollster Spencer Kimball. How are you today, Spencer?
I'm good, Lauren. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. We're looking forward to the Iowa caucuses right now, and we're about 100 days out from the actual day. But I want to take it a step back. Can you tell me why Iowa votes first?
Well, Iowa kind of started their caucus system in 1972, and that is when the Democrats reformed their nominating system. In 1972, George McGovern actually doesn't come in first, but he comes in second in Iowa against uncommitted. That was the people they decided to vote for pretty much none of the above, and went to the convention unpledged. But since 1972, Iowa has been the first caucus state, though other states have tried to compete with them, like Louisiana, Arizona, over the last 50 years to try to usurp them. The only state that kind of gave them a pass was New Hampshire. We know New Hampshire is the first in the nation primary, and after 1972, New Hampshire passed a state law that would make themselves the first primary state. So Iowa gets to be the first caucus state, sort of. New Hampshire gets to be the first primary state, and then a couple of other states have been fighting them over the last 50 years to try to usurp that, but have been unable to. And so what we've seen in Iowa in that time is the makings of, as I said, George McGovern, Jimmy Carter's campaign. George Bush in 1980 came out of Iowa. Gary Hart in 84. Even if we go into the modern day, look at President Obama. He jumps out of Iowa, winning the caucus, and kind of propels him into that nomination. So Iowa's a key state, and it's been with us now for about 50 years.
Well, let's jump right to the polls. I want to look at the first Democratic caucus poll that you have. Now, Biden in this poll has remained constant since about March, but the others have kind of fluctuated. Can you tell me more about them?
Yeah, so obviously right now all the candidates are going to Iowa, they're campaigning, and they're meeting with different voters. And what they're finding is that some are being more attractive than others. So for instance, like Kamala Harris, when we did that poll back in February and another one in March, she was doing very well. Now she's down to 2%. And in Iowa, you need to be at least 15% to be viable. So where did we see the other shakeup? As you mentioned, Bernie Sanders, his numbers have dropped from about 23, 24% down to 11%. And who has picked up that vote? It looks like Elizabeth Warren, who went from about 9, 10 points all the way up to tied now with Joe Biden at 23%. So we've seen a lot of shifting amongst those top 2 and 3 candidates. The one candidate that seems to be moving is Mayor Pete Buttigieg. In February, he was an asterisk in our poll. By March, he was at 11%, and now we see him in October at 16%. That tells me that he's building a good grassroots organization in Iowa and kind of attracting a different crowd than what some of the other candidates are going after, particularly with Democratic evangelical voters.
Does he have a that's surpassing Warren?
Well, he's within the margin of error, and there's a lot of movement that comes in Iowa in that last couple of weeks. So if he can stay within that top 3, and if Bernie is able to drop, if we see Biden drop a little, I think Buttigieg also has some room on the right to kind of come up the middle and pick up some of those votes. And so I wouldn't count him out at this point. He's certainly in contention for the win in Iowa, and certainly to try to propel him into the sequence of primaries and caucuses that will follow.
Bernie Sanders is recovering from a heart attack from just a week ago. Do you think that this will hurt him?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in a lot of the polling his numbers kind of slip in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, the heart attack, I think, raises a doubt in some voters' minds. Now, it doesn't wipe him off and put him at 2%. He's still at, I think, 13% in Iowa, which puts him right at the verge of viability. But we've seen a lot of movement towards Warren, and I think that vote is coming from the Sanders camp, and something he's going to have to try to recover from, if possible, depending on his health. And then, obviously, if he was to get the nomination, I think a lot of speculation would be on his vice presidential nominee at that point.
Now, the big question that everyone has is, can one of these 12 Democratic candidates take down President Trump?
Right, especially in Iowa. Remember, Iowa was a state that went for President Obama in 2008, and then it flipped by 2016 to go for Trump by 9.5 points. And in 2016, Trump won all 4 congressional districts. And that's important because 3 out of the 4 are currently held by Democrats, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd. And the 4th district is held by a Republican, Stephen King, who's a very controversial figure within the party. He only won by 3 points. This is a district that Trump won by like 30 points. So as we take a look around the state, you realize there's a lot of competitiveness in those first 3. Can Trump hold that base in the 4th district? And what the early polling is looking like, a very competitive race. He trails, I think, Bernie Sanders by a couple of points, and he's up by a few points on Warren and Biden. So this is certainly not a slam dunk for the president. Even though he won it by 9.5 last time, it seems that it'll come out of the gate pretty competitive, and he'll have to make the case, particularly as we see a couple of the manufacturing plants like John Deere start cutting staff, and obviously the farming and the China trade deals and the tariffs obviously have had some impact on the farming community out there. So all of those together we'll have to see, but it does make the president more vulnerable in a state that people thought would be pretty locked up for him at this point.
I want to take a look at the head-to-heads poll that you have for us. As you mentioned, Sanders is the only one kind of projected to possibly surpass President Trump. But with all of this impeachment inquiry, do you think that this will ultimately hurt him in the end?
So the impeachment story is interesting because I think as we look at these polls, we can see that nearly 2/3 of Democrats want to impeach the president. Overall in Iowa, it was about 43, 42% that wanted to impeach, about 47, 48% that didn't want to impeach. But you can see there's a large number that was supportive of impeachment, and then when you get into the Democratic primary, an even larger number, of majority. So the Democrats have to figure out if they're going to move forward with this, because on the backside, we asked voters their 9 most important issues, and impeachment came up 7th. At 6%. Amongst Democrats, it was a little bit higher at 10%. And so what happens in these situations, it's very similar to what we see with gun policy. Background checks are very popular with folks. They have 80, 90% approval. But the importance of background checks for voters is not that high. Gun policy falls right around the environment and impeachment for voters. It doesn't rank with healthcare or with the economy. And so what this does is it kind of puts the politicians in a tough spot. They have to make the case that this is the most important issue for voters, and the Democrats have not been able to do that yet. Now, we're still in the very beginning of the inquiry, but that's the case that they're going to have to make in order to make sure that their impeachment process is worthwhile and voters are on board with the amount of resources that it takes to go through an impeachment proceeding.
What's the chance that Democrats will be able to raise that percentage up higher of putting President Trump's impeachment at the top of their list?
It's you have to make the case, so the evidence is going to be a big part of the case to the public of why this should be their number 1 issue. But if you recall back in like 2010, 2012, the Republicans spent a good period of time on the budget deficit and deficit spending. And really, that was a major issue in the 2012 campaign, but it's kind of fallen off the radar of most people because neither party has picked it up. And so we'll see if the Democrats can keep a constant drumbeat on this issue. And that's a really tough thing to do with this president because there's always new music coming out of different issues, and it's hard to stay focused just on one inquiry. But we'll see if they can make that case over the next 2 to 3 months as people are starting to vote in these primaries and caucuses. And then obviously where the candidates stand on it. If you've noticed, Joe Biden has come out much stronger for the impeachment because the Democratic primary voters are much more looking for that impeachment. But before they can get there, they'll have to make that case, and I think that's going to be a stumbling block that they'll have to get over in order to have a successful 2020 season.
Now, I want to touch on Vice President Joe Biden briefly and his son Hunter, and sort of how President Trump has now turned the spotlight onto them.
So this is what we've seen, classic campaign techniques. If we go back to 1972, it was Richard Nixon going after Ed Muskie, the Canuck letter, remember the wife, him crying in front of the Manchester Union leader. Those were all tactics to try, from the incumbent, to try to knock out the front runner of the Democrat, who was the senator from Maine at the time. He doesn't get the nomination. These are similar tactics that we're seeing where the Republicans are trying to soften up who they perceive to be their strongest opponent in Joe Biden, and using this as kind of a wedge issue to make that case. But as we've seen in Iowa, it really hasn't impacted Joe Biden's numbers yet, at least in Iowa. He was at 25%, now he's at 23% over the course of 8 months. So we think that the Republicans will have to make more of a case if they want to connect Biden in with this inquiry on impeachment and the Ukraine deal. So they've got still more work to do on their end in that regard, but it looks like Biden has, at least in the meantime, been able to survive that accusation.
And we'll have more on that developing story
Next week when we take a look at our national poll. And we're going to be asking not only about the Ukraine, but we'll look at Syria, troops, and some of the foreign policy that the president is pushing out there as he goes into the last year of his administration's first term.
Thank you so much, Spencer.
Lauren, thank you.
That's all we have for the Emerson Polling Report. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.